Greetings, friends. Wanding Rizka here, and this is the weekly Russian Ukrainian War update for the week of June 3rd through June 9th of 2024. And if you want to continue receiving these Russian Ukrainian War weekly updates, make sure to subscribe to my channel, give this video a thumbs up, share this video around, comment your thoughts, and so forth. And so in this week, we actually have a lot of interesting updates, and I am ready to share that with you. And we're going to begin, like last week, in the Chasov Yar direction. Now, one thing I've been saying is that during this Russian summer offensive, one thing I've been kind of falling into is that the Russian, any offensive action, no, as I continuously mentioned in these videos, there's not going to be a big arrow offensive until one side collapses from attrition, which is not happening this year or anytime soon. So one thing we should expect in terms of offensives is the slow grinding offensives, things that, but like very intense. We see obviously slow grinding along the entire front, but when one side wants to focus on one area, we see a very intensification of actions. And like we saw this with Avdiivka, for example. We saw in October of last year, the Russians made a very big effort to try to encircle Avdiivka. There was a very powerful assault there. Same thing when the Ukrainians were attacking in Robotyne. They obviously put a bunch of troops there to try to, attack. It wasn't just small scale raids and such. And the Russian offensive here, where the Russians are focusing for the summer, just as for the winter it was Avdiivka, in the summer it is Chasov Yar. And this week the Russians made a lot of progress already made a lot of big moves to continue their goal of taking Chasov Yar for their summer offensive. Now, the first thing the Russians had to do was reach the Sovietsky Donetsk-Donbass Canal. But in order to do so, they had to break what they call the Canal Microdistrict. Now, you might be wondering, microdistrict, that seems pretty easy to take. The problem with the microdistrict is that, as you can see, these are in the, where the Russians are attacking from a low rise, from a lower elevation, and they are attacking through open fields right up into a bunch of high-rise buildings here. And so the Ukrainians have had a very perfectly good view to overlook this entire area and prevent the Russians from attacking. And then when the Russians do make it, it'll be very hard to assault this. So the Russians have been assaulting this for almost 2 months now. And this week, the Russians made a bunch of progress in this area. Now, one thing I want to keep in mind is that the map I use, Syriac, I use his map to kind of show, because it's very intuitive. I think it's very user-friendly. But the thing is, he has taken a hiatus in terms of updating his map. And so I have to update. I'll be using his map, but I'll be posting updates based on, because I follow, a couple dozen other mappers and such. And I still follow the war, so the war is still going on. And so you might not see the updated map per se, but I will try to show with my own coloring on the exact situation where the map is. Now, one thing that is about this is that the Russians have basically, and the big news of this week is that the eastern Chasov Yar has fallen, for the most part. It depends on who you're asking. If you're asking pro-Russian sources, they are saying that the Russians basically took the Canal Microdistrict and the Ukrainians fell back to the trenches that are behind the Sovietsky Donetsk-Donbass Canal. The Ukrainians put a bunch of trenches behind it because they know crossing the canal would be a bit of a more risky proposition. And obviously the Ukrainians don't want the Russians to take this new objective, these residential area right here, this area right here, because if the Russians break into here, then they have an open line to central Chasov Yar, which is obviously the goal of taking it. But first things first, they had to clear the center, the eastern, the Canal Microdistrict. One thing to keep in mind is, and we basically got a bunch of geolocated footage this week that confirms one thing that even Ukrainian sources admit is that eastern Chasov Yar of the eastern part of this, at least this part, has come under complete control of Russian forces. The western part, these high-rise buildings right here, are some sources are saying the Ukrainians are still here, but a lot, if the Russians have basically taken, since the Russians have taken basically most of this canals, this micro-district already, then the Russians will basically have a lot easier time clearing out the rest of these high-rise buildings, and the Ukrainians will retreat back to their trenches behind this canal here. Taking this micro district was very important. The Russians have been trying to put the squeeze on it. They took the southern part of it, or at least they tried to encircle from the south. They broke through to the north last week, and now the Russians have taken these basically have bared fruit, and now the front line kind of. Right now the Russians are clearing this district, and I have basically the Russians have achieved their first objective in taking Chasov Yar, which is reaching the Sovietsky Donetsk Donbass Canal, and so the Russians in the next week or so are going to clear, secure their positions in Kalinova, secure their positions in this area, in this micro district, clear it up, secure their positions here. The front line will go something like this. And then the Russians will have to we'll have to see what the Russians' next moves are. The Russians will basically try to do the same thing with central Chasov Yar itself, just as they did with this micro district. This is like a microcosm of Chasov Yar. So the Russians will reach the canal, and then the Russians will start trying to cross the canal, secure some bridgeheads. The Russians are going to try to secure in the north. The main focus is going to be to secure this hill, this mining area, and to cut off Chasov Yar from the north. From the south here, the Russians will try to get into these forests, which are littered with trenches, and try to secure a bridgehead here, and try to reach the village of Stupochki, and basically try to encircle Chasov Yar from the south. So one thing to keep in mind is the Russians will start battling for this residential area in front of the center of Chasov Yar. To pin the Ukrainian troops down, and as they're going to also try to put the squeeze on Chasov Yar, try to basically have the front line kind of start cutting off from the north, from the south, from the north, and then have basically three axes of attack, and basically squeeze the Ukrainians back to Konstantinovka. That is what the Russians are going to be doing for the next 3 months or 4 months or so as they try to take Chasov Yar. But again, the first job was to reach the Sovietsky Donbass Canal. And it's now while it's not impossible, now the Russians, it's going to be a bit hard for them to cross the canal, create a bridgehead, and continuously try to encircle Chasov Yar. So it's going to be a big ask, but the Russians have achieved their first goal of taking this micro district. So that is very good news for the Russians. In terms of Kalinova, the situation is being a bit cleared up. We still don't have 100% confirmation about the positions in Kalinova, but one thing I am certain that is that the Russians don't have positions in the other side of the canal here, which they don't need to at the moment, but they do need to secure Kalinova in order to continue their offensive. But most sources say Kalinova is still being contested, but so the Russians are still trying to secure themselves in this village, and the Ukrainians are trying to stop them from doing that. So Kalinova is still being contested. So we'll have to see if the Russians could secure it and not let the Ukrainians get back into it. So yeah, Chasov Yar is very big news for the Russians this week in doing one of the main goals, one of the main objectives in order to take Chasov Yar. So yeah, that was the main front. Now let's going to go to the other place where the Russians are pushing, and this is where the Donetsk front could be probably one of the other main fronts besides Chasov Yar. This is also where we see the most intensification of Russian actions. And this week, the Russians made a lot of progress. Let's talk about them. Not as big as capturing the micro-district and doing a breakthrough there, but they are still making a lot of progress here. The Russians are basically, at this point, clearing the fields and trying to reach, and again, the goal of the Donetsk front here is to reach the Vochachka River. This is the river right here. And the Russians are basically going to be trying to capture everything, to the east and south of this rail line and this Vochachka River. This is where the Russians are focusing. And the Russians will probably also try to cut the Pokrovsk-Konstantinovka highway. And the Russians made a lot of progress in terms of, or at least some solid gains this week, and that to talk about. First thing is the Battle of Sokil. The Russians have been trying to take this is part of the next Ukrainian line defensive. The Ukrainians are set up Sokil, Novosilikva, Pershi as new defense villages after they lost their lines of defense after the fall of Avdiivka. They are falling back and still trying to secure themselves. And the Russians had to move through these fields from more Chechny to try to reach Sokil. And this week the Russians have actually managed to occupy, or at least Sokil is now in the gray zone. It's still a little bit in the fog of war. For example, we saw geolocated footage of Russian troops entering this town and dropping troops off right here. Some sources are saying that this area in the south of Sokil is under Russian control, while as these northern, uh, this giant trench network, this fortification, and everything to the north here is still under Ukrainian control. And one thing to keep in mind is that in this configuration is that while Sokil itself might be under almost full Russian control, it's not necessarily conquering the village itself that matters. It's the tactical positioning of the village. So, like, in order to actually fully exploit this tactical maneuvering, the Russians need to clear this northern fortification that is here, and they need to clear the Ukrainians that are in the north here. And so, I'm expecting the Russians will try to do some sort of combined offensive to try to take this area to secure their, gains here a bit more. And then I would assume they're going to, and if they could hold the southern part of Sokol and occupy this, tree line here, then, they could do a double pincer, push the Ukrainians out of this fortification, force them back to, this area, and, then they could start battling for these two small villages. But then, since the front line will go something like this, that means most of Sokol will be under Russian control, and they can continue pushing towards the main goal of the Russians in not the main goal, but like the tactical goal for this summer, which is reaching the village of Porez right here. Because then this Porez will be the outskirts, the frontline village town, as the Ukrainians fall back to a new line of defense. And it will no longer be the Donetsk of Avdiivka front. It will be the Pokrovsk front at that point, because now the Ukrainians are going to be falling back to the towns and villages that are supposed to guard the major Donbass city of Pokrovsk. And it is no longer just a battle for trying to push the Ukrainians away from Donetsk. But in order to do that, they need to push the Ukrainians away from Donetsk first, which requires them reaching that Vuchachka River I mentioned earlier. So the Battle of Sokol is going, the Russians have occupied the southern part of it, according to most sources, but the Russians still need to try to squeeze out the Ukrainians from the north here. Speaking of the north, a lot of sources are saying that the village of Nova Alexandrivka is contested half and half. The Ukrainians are kind of along, in this lake in the western part of Nova Alexandrivka, and the Russians are in the eastern part, and then they're battling for the center of the town. So the village is being contested. And one thing I actually see here is that while I mentioned that the main goal might be reaching, something like this, I think the Russians also want to cut the main highway connecting Konstantinivka and Pokrovsk, because that will significantly damage the logistical situation for Ukrainians in Donbass. Because then if they take Nova Alexandrivka, right, and, let's say the front line's kind of like this, then I'm expecting the Russians will also continue trying to push forward and try to capture the village of Vozhenka here, and try to kind of make the front line, take these two villages, and then the front line will go something like this then instead. And once it goes something like this, and the Russians have these areas under Russian control, then the Russians will have a complete open view. The Ukrainian movement will go along here, and then the Russians on this area, in this area, will be able to bombard, have direct line of sight for whatever Ukrainian convoys come through this area. So I think that the Russian. So in order to take a broad view of what the Russians have planned for the summer in Donbass, is something like this. This is what the Russians want to take for the summer, and probably, if the Russians can, try to put this under direct control. But we'll have to see how the situation unfolds to have the Russians cut this main highway right here. Because then a future Russian goal, obviously, is that once Chasov Yar falls and the Russians are in this position, then maybe for the winter of 2024, and then going into the 2025, the next main Russian focus could be Toretsk, because then the Russians at this point, hopefully, if they do their summer goals, the Russians will obviously have Chasov Yar, and the Russians will be in a very secured situation in the south here, and then you could definitely see how the Russians will try to start moving towards Toretsk. So that is probably what the Russians will plan on doing. The Russians are also making a lot of gains in the south here in the Donetsk front. The Russians are expanding the zone of control in Umanska. basically now the front line kind of runs along this water barrier. But we also got some sources showing that the Russians have tried to have a little bit of a bridgehead here, and that the Russians occupied up to this point right here. And so, they're getting very, trying to clear the fields between Novoselivka, Pershi, and Umanska. Along with this, they were going to try to maybe try to cut off Yasnobronovka from the south, because obviously they want to reach this area right here. It is still a bit of a pickle why they're not able to take Yasnobronovka and push the Ukrainians back behind this river. But I think that is one of the goals for the Russians, is try to capture Yasnobronovka. But again, they've captured Umanska, 2-3 weeks ago, and now they are expanding the bridgehead and pushing the Ukrainians towards Novopokrovska, Novoselivka, Pershi. Another thing is the Russians finally achieved one of the main goals. And they reached the final outpost, in my opinion, of the Donetsk campaign, which is reaching the Karlovka. And, they finally, I think the Russians are going to stop at this kind of water ravine. People are saying the battle for Karlovka has begun, and in a sense it has, because this is the eastern outskirts of Karlovka, which the Russians have occupied this week. But the Russians had to occupy it because it gives them a natural defense line along this kind of small little river. And, the Ukrainians obviously have Karlovka and the Vachachka River as defense. And then, I think the Russians are going to stop here. This is, the Russians are then going to now focus on Yasnobronovka a little bit to the north here. And kind of the main focus here is reaching, they've reached now that they're here, the Ukrainian front line is in Karlovka, and Ukrainian artillery is in Kalinova and Miryak. And so, obviously from here, the Ukrainians can't shell Donetsk anymore. It is too far away with conventional artillery, and that was the main goal of the Donetsk campaign, is to push the Ukrainians away from the front line. Because when the front line was in, say, Peremyska, earlier this year, the Ukrainian artillery could be in Natalieva, and that could still shell Donetsk. But now that the front line is here, the Ukrainian artillery is more further back. They can no longer shell Donetsk. So the Russians are, they have reached, I think, where they are going to now stop. So I don't think we're going to see a battle for Karlovka, but it is pretty significant that the Russians have finally reached kind of the end goal of the battle to save Donetsk from artillery shelling. So that was very significant for the Russians. In the South Donetsk area, one thing to keep, in terms of, Krasnogorivka and the Ugledar direction. Let's talk about this area right here a little bit. One thing to keep in mind, Krasnogorivka, is we saw geolocated footage of Russian control of these high-rise buildings right here. So we know that the Russians are basically right at the edge of the high-rise buildings at the center of the town and in the residential area. So, we have a lot of... So we got some more geolocated footage of where the front line is along this Krasnogorivka. We also saw an attack of the Russians where they managed to occupy up to this area of the railroad, and this is significant because not only as the Russians expand the bridgehead to the north here, they severely compromise the Ukrainian defenses in this area and near Grigorivka. And so if the Russians want to secure their gains in Grigorivka right here, they need to basically kick the Ukrainians out of here. And since the Russians broke through in Krasnogorivka, they were able to start advancing to the north of this water reservoir and cut off the supplies for the Ukrainians here and force them back to Hostr, further back. So, the Russians are still battling for the center of Krasnogorivka. The Ukrainians are still holding on to these high-rise buildings and this hospital. So, the Ukrainians are still holding on. They're not, they're not trying to let the city fall completely. But again, the Russians are making slow and steady progress, and Krasnogorivka is slowly getting captured, which is needed again to push the Ukrainians away from the Donetsk. In the South Donetsk area, the Russians actually activated on this front, and the battle for Ugledar is continuing. So the Russians this week managed to capture the village of Pereskovka right here. So the front line kind of goes something like this. They managed to kind of occupy Pereskovka, and this is significant because this village allows them a starting off point to start encircling Konstantinovka from the north. The Russians are basically trying to redo what they did in Novomikhailivka in Konstantinovka. And one thing to keep in mind there is, in the Konstantinovka is the main goal. If Konstantinovka falls, this will allow the Russians to start outflanking the Ugledar defenders. And so the Russians activated along the entire Ugledar front, except in Ugledar itself. They are now trying to assault Konstantinovka from every direction. In the north, they captured Perestroivka and are slowly trying to. They also are moving south from Pobeba and managed to capture this tree line to the south here. And I have no doubts that the Russians will start trying to clear up, kind of shorten the front line and and kind of link up the defenses with Pobeba and Perestroivka here. Try to cut off the, flatten these tree. What am I trying to say here? I'm basically trying to say that they are trying to get to the north of Konstantinovka, clear the fields, and then the Ukrainians are going to start trying to hold on to their positions to the north of the river here, and these dachas and farms and such. The Russians are also activated in the south there. They're not just trying to take the north. Now, it's not as sexy here, but it is very significant because not only while taking a village seems pretty, and there's no village to the south of Konstantinovka, the Russians managed to expand significantly their advance in the south here. There is a combined tank assault from Novomikhailivka and managed to enter right to the outskirts of Konstantinovka. And that means the Russians now are right on the outskirts of the town, and the Russians could have a position to start slowly, now they could attack Konstantinovka and try to secure themselves, maybe in these farms, maybe in this area right here, in some, in the more eastern part of Konstantinovka, and just kind of have a positioning here. And that is what and so the Russians, by advancing from Novomikhailivka and taking the southern part, the fields to the south of Konstantinovka, or some of the fields in the south of Konstantinovka, they have a good position to start assault operations to secure themselves a little bit of a foothold in Konstantinovka. So the Battle for Konstantinovka has now officially started, and it is one of the last steps the Russians have to do before they start their offensive in Ugledar. And I think just as the winter offensive was to capture Novomikhailivka, the goals of the Russian offensive for the summer is going to be taking Konstantinovka, so that in the winter of 2024, and then going into 2025, the Russians might focus on Ugledar. No changes in the Zaporozhye or Kherson front. The Russians are still trying to clear the northern farms of Staromayorska. The Ukrainians are still holding on. They have positions in this tree line right here and in the farms. The Russians basically are confirmed to be in the center of Staromayorska, as we mentioned before, and in the south of Orozhina. Right now, the Russians are trying to clear these farms to the north of Staromayorska, kind of have the front line go something like this, and then kind of be able to attack Orozhina and flank it. So they're trying to pin the Ukrainian forces in Orozhina, and then but try to push them out from northern Staromayorska so that they could outflank Orozhina, and then have the front line be more straightened out. So have the front line kind of go like this a little bit, and then that will flatten the front line, and I think that will. I don't think the Russians will continue advancing. Maybe they will. Maybe they want to capture Makarivka, take back Revnopol, and maybe have the push the front line a bit more to the north here. But this is not a main axis of attack like it is in Donetsk or Chasov Yar, because this is an area just to pin Ukrainian troops down. So that is the main directions. There's been a lot of activation in the Siversk front. The Russians are actually making very big moves to try to take the village of Rostolivka. They actually managed to get right to the outskirts of the town right here, and they're right on the outskirts of Rostolivka. And so I wouldn't be surprised. Now this village is reduced to ruin. It's been a frontline village for like a year now, so obviously it's reduced to ruin, but. Taking it basically allows the Russians a natural defense with the river, and then they'll be able to secure their their positioning to the again, the Russians are pushing a bit more to the east here, moving along the rail lines towards Vimvka, Ivano-Dyrivka, going to the southern outskirts of these villages. However, the more they move up here, Ukrainians still have positions more to the west here. They obviously have all this area, and they obviously will be able to start outflanking the Russians. And the Russians definitely want to maybe have a little bit more buffer zone here, and taking Drozdolivka and taking the fields next to it would give the Russians, to flatten the front line a little bit and not make this so much of a salient. So the Russians are getting closer and closer to Rozdolovka. No changes in the Liman front. In the Kupiansk front, the Russians are still building on their gains that they've made during the last month or so. One thing is the Russians managed to start advancing to the north of Stepova Novoselivka. They managed to capture the northern part of Ivanivka right here. Some geolocated footage shows that, and the Ukrainians are trying to stop the Russians from reaching the northern part of Stepova Novoselivka. So the Russians are obviously trying to secure their, just as the Russians are advancing along this rail line with some small success this week, but not too much. But the Russians are obviously the goal of the Russians here is to reach to the south of Stepova Novoselivka, which they're doing here from Klishivka, and this week they made some more gains to the north of Ivanivka to start trying to outflank Stepova Novoselivka from the north, and then obviously they're going to try to put the squeeze on it and force the Ukrainians out from the village in a combined attack, and push the Ukrainians towards Korlivka and things like that, back towards Kupiansk basically. So the battle for Stepova Novoselivka is going slow. I think this is not a main axis of Russian attack. I think this is like another place to pin down Ukrainian troops, though they have made some progress here. And the Russians are still trying to improve their positioning to the south of Novoselivka and trying to get to the north of Slimlavka here. So the Russians are still also putting pressure on these three villages right here. In the Kharkov front, this is actually the only front actually where the Ukrainians are on the attack. So the Russians entered here; they are now holding on, but now the Russians are on the defensive here, and we know this because the Ukrainians launched a counterattack, and now the battle for Lipsy has basically ended. The Ukrainians managed to hold themselves in Lipsy, and now the battle for Globokha has begun. Well, not begun; it's getting restarted. Basically, we got geolocated footage of the Ukrainians doing a counterattack and managed to push the Russians out of these dachas to the south here and started attacking the Russians towards Globokha. And the Ukrainians need to push the Russians out of Globokha because this is basically this is a very strong fortification, strong town that the Russians could hold on. And if they lose this, then it's just a bunch of open fields and little border villages that are of no use. Globokha is basically the first kind of I wouldn't say a natural defense, but it gives the Russians a good a positioning to further inland than just the border regions. And taking Globokha would basically negate this entire front right here in Lipsy. But the Ukrainians made multiple attacks to try to push to capture this town and failed. But one thing they did do is stop the battle for Lipsy, and now the front line kind of goes something like this. And so, the Russians are still holding on to Globokha. Obviously, the Russians are very strong in defense. So it's going to be very, the Ukrainians could hold off the Russians in Kharkov, but it's another thing to push them entirely out. But the Ukrainians are definitely trying after redeploying a bunch of forces to Kharkov. So Globokha is now under attack, and we shall see if the Russians could hold on and how much the Ukrainians could push. One thing in the Vachansk front is that the Ukrainians are making slow and steady, or holding on to northern Vachansk. This is back and forth. Right now the Russians or the Ukrainians are holding on to what they call the Citadel, the center of Vachansk right here. They are also more to the east here. They managed to have capture certain residential areas to the north here, and the Russians are mostly in this area right here. And basically the battle is going on in this area, in the center of the northern part of Vachansk. One thing I've said is that the Russians want to take northern Vachansk and then have the front line be along this river, which splits Vachansk in half. However, the longer the Ukrainians hold on to the northern sector, especially now that they outnumber the Russians in this sector, the more it's going to be very, now it's not a guarantee that the Ukrainians will lose northern Vachansk. I still think the Ukrainians have a lot up there, a lot to do if they want to push the Russians out of Vachansk. But for the Russians, it's no longer a cakewalk to try to basically split Vachansk in half and have the front line go something like this. The Ukrainians are holding on doggedly to the center of the northern part of Vachansk, and so it's going to take a lot for them. It's going to take a lot for the Russians to push them out, especially now that they're outnumbered, and it's going to be very hard for them to push them out. So that's the end of this video. I hope you guys enjoyed. Hope you guys enjoyed this weekly update. If you want to continue receiving these weekly Russian Ukrainian War updates, be sure to subscribe to my channel, give this video a thumbs up, comment your thoughts, share this video around. So aim high and wander on.